Hello and welcome to a new episode of Bite-Sized Book History. I'm your host, Allie Alvis, who you may know better as Book Historia. I'm a book historian and rare book cataloger at antiquarian book dealer Type Punch Matrix. So, remember Volvels? Those little spinning paper calculators sometimes found in old books? Well, those aren't the only things that move in books. And things that move in books aren't just for scientific purposes. I'm sure many of you have fond memories of playing with pop-up books, either as a kid or more recently, like this cool Tron one I just got. Pop-ups and Volvels are part of a whole host of movable books, and this type of book has been around since before the advent of print in the West. Let's take a peek at some books that are a bit more dynamic than your average page-turner. As I mentioned in my episode all about Volvels, the first recorded Volvel can be found in a 13th century manuscript by Catalan mystic Ramon Llull, and the first recorded liftable flap book, according to Anne R. Montanaro, was an anatomical manuscript produced in 1345. But movable books really came into their own with the advent of print technology in the West. For centuries, movable books were used to communicate scientific ideas in a dynamic way. Flap books allowed 16th century student physicians to peek inside the human body, as the morality of human dissection was still somewhat contested in this period. The first anatomical flap works were actually more posters than books. In 1538, Heinrich Vogther produced the first so-called anatomical fugitive sheet, featuring liftable flaps of different organs, which inspired many imitators. And onto a different science, you may not think of math as a riveting subject for pop-up books, but for geometry, pop-ups came in very handy. The first English translation of Euclid, published in 1570, featured flaps that could be folded up into shapes. Each little flap was individually hand-glued to the page. All movable books in this period had to be hand-assembled, either by the publisher or by the reader. Sometimes not at all. Examples do exist of unassembled Volvels still in their component parts. And Volvels, you may remember, were the calculators of their day, allowing users to figure out anything from the positions of constellations to a ship's location at sea. On the more artistic side of things, famous 18th century landscape designer Capability Brown and his successors used flap books to illustrate before and afters for their landscape designs. Of course, there were a few movable books that were a bit more playful. Donato Bertelli published two humorous flap books in the late 16th century, featuring scandalous scenes to be revealed for a laugh. But it wasn't until the 18th century that movable books started being produced for kids. After John Newbery pioneered the concept of children's literature in the 1700s, many other publishers were very interested in marketing to this new readership. In the early days, children's books were all instructive or moralistic in nature. But by the 1760s, this began to change. The first movable books for children were produced by English publisher Robert Sayer. He published a series of little flap books called Metamorphosis, which became known as Harlequinades thanks to their clown main characters. Flaps were also used in William Grimaldi's Toilet Book of the 1820s. No, this was not a book about potties, but about the moral importance of maintaining a good appearance. These books were largely targeted at girls, and featured items that could be lifted to reveal the virtues they represented. During this period, the so-called tunnel book really came into its own as well. Based on earlier peep show books, which were in turn based on 15th and 16th century studies of optics, this accordion-like book works a lot like a stage set. Figures and scenery are placed on different folds of a paper accordion, sandwiched between two boards. By stretching the accordion, the reader makes a sort of paper tunnel, and the figures look as if they're receding into the far distance. The construction of the tunnel under the Thames River between 1825 and 1843 spawned a huge number of these books, depicting the passage under the river as well as the ships above. These books were beloved by both children and adults, and were a popular souvenir of a trip to London in the 19th century. The 1860s saw an explosion of movable books for kids. With newer, advanced color printing technologies, these books were a feast for the eyes. London publisher Dean & Son established a whole department of paper engineers and artists, developing a mechanism to pop out a scene by pulling on a ribbon. The highest quality color printing of this period was being done in Germany, and German pop-ups from this period are particularly lovely. Bavaria-based publisher Ernest Nister pioneered the idea of a true pop-up book, with characters that stood up automatically when a flap was moved. He was particularly well known for his Dissolving Views book, in which one picture turned into another by rotating a wheel. Munich artist Lothar Meggendorfer was noted for his complex movable illustrations, with multiple tabs and levers to create several points of animation on a page. The first true pop-up books as we think of them were produced by Englishman S. Louis Giraud, and didn't hit the shelves until 1929. His books featured the familiar double-page spread, which stood up automatically as the pages were opened. But we have Disney to thank for the term pop-up. Their collaboration with Blue Ribbon Books to bring their animated silly symphonies into book form in the 1930s coined the word. It has been said that they even trademarked pop-up at the time, although I've heard mixed reports on that, and it is certainly not a trademark today. But it would be pretty par for the course for Disney. 20th and 21st century pop-up books are beloved by children and adults, both as kids' book features and as fine art. Much like miniature books, there's a society dedicated to movable books, appropriately named the Movable Book Society. Established in 1993, the Society maintains a list of special collections with significant holdings of pop-up books, as well as links to interesting resources about their creation and the people who make them. They also have lists of dealers that specialize in pop-up books. You can find the link to the Society's website in my description below. That does it for this episode of Bite-Sized Book History. Pop-ups and movable books were actually a topic requested by a viewer. So if you have any topics that you would like to see me talk about in future episodes, make sure to drop a comment below. Also, check out my description for links to my Etsy and Patreon, and remember to like and subscribe for more book history content. I will see you next time, and remember, don't bite your books.